Do you remember how weird the 1990s were? Not as garish as the 1980s perhaps, but twice as overconfident. Technology was literally changing beneath our feet week by week as this constant stream of new technological innovations were launched. Each aimed to sweep the last one aside as fast as possible. Within a few short years, video games changed completely. They went from these dark, black and white Technicolor nightmares to something that became increasingly more complex and increasingly more competent, something that looked more and more like visual artwork. We could literally see the technology, both the hardware and the software, evolving before our eyes. And this wasn't iterative new releases, this was a complete reinvention each time. In the video game console market, Sega was seeking to overtake Nintendo, and it was doing this by focusing on making its games brighter and faster, more eye-catching and trying to appeal to a teenage audience, by shaking off the kid-friendly Nintendo brand. Perhaps no character embodies the pace of change and the radical attitude prevalent in the early 1990s, like Sonic the Hedgehog. He was marketed as someone with a cool attitude, just the right combination of a serious and carefree, and the character of Sonic struck a nerve with mainstream culture in a way that many other corporate mascots of the time could only dream of. Sega, rival console manufacturer Nintendo, had always been behind their Japanese rivals, struggling to find a way to one-up that pesky plumber. But finally, in 1991, to several good but not quite there contenders, Sega launched Sonic the Hedgehog as their first true frontman. He was bright, vibrant, energetic and fast. Sonic was arguably the first video game platform to truly challenge Nintendo's hallmark franchise. Sonic the Hedgehog, well, it's a flawed game. In fact, from a historical perspective, it feels more like an engine tech demo, as its concepts have all been so flawlessly superannuated several times over by excellent sequels. But the 1991 original on the Mega Drive, or the Sega Genesis depending on your region, it lit a spark that radically changed the video game industry forever. To explain why, I suppose you'd need to revisit the video game scene of the 1990s. Following the video game crash of the 1980s, two international console makers clearly led the pack: the Nintendo Super NES and the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis depending on your region. In most of the world, however, the Super NES wasn't just a SNES, it was a Nintendo. If you wanted to play a video game, well, you plugged your cartridge into your Nintendo. And the best-selling games on the SNES was Super Mario World, a platformer that sold in excess of 20 million copies. The beloved third game in the Super Mario series was the template for all video game platformers to base them on. Now, the genre had been around since the late 1970s, and with every video game generation, it was getting more and more proficient, introducing concepts such as scrolling movement, varying environments, or attempting to imbue enemies with true artificial intelligence rather than just set patterns of movement. Now, there were many variants on the topic, such as Mega Man, run and jump and shoot, Alex Kidd, run and jump and punch, Metroid, run and jump and shoot and explore an interconnected map, DuckTales, run and jump and bounce on a pogo stick. The concepts were varied and there were many more getting equally more bizarre. But largely, almost all of these were based off the template laid down by Nintendo. There was a sense that to succeed, a console needed a platforming mascot, and the king of the platformer was Nintendo, and Mario specifically. Shigeru Miyamoto's team had, over a couple of iterations, seemed to perfect Mario's movement. It was fast and responsive, his jump was high, and the mechanical template was clearly set. But then, in 1991, for the first time, that pervasive worldview was probably shaken. The new engine developed by Yuji Naka and his team, well, it could scroll in all directions, not just left to right, which was novel but not exactly groundbreaking. But then for the first time, terrains were not flat or simple triangular shapes. They were uneven, curved, and sometimes even looping. Sonic visibly shifts up and down as he moves over bumps in the ground. And most clearly of all, there is retention of momentum. Unlike Mario, who has a set jump height and speed, Sonic's controls are entirely dependent on his movement and surroundings. It is hard to explain now what an innovation this was at the time. Sega milked it for everything they had, later labelling it as blast processing, a unique selling point on the console that's more about a cool catch name than any real gameplay innovation. but Sonic's movement and physics were designed from the start to behave halfway between a traditional platformer and a pinball machine, as evidenced by some early levels such as Spring Yard Zone. At any point while moving on the ground, players can press down and they will roll into a ball. In this state, they can pick up speed when rolling down hills, gathering increased momentum and earning the ability to leap to unimaginable heights. Sonic's jump height, his speed, his very physics were responsive to the world around him. Many people have since described Sonic games under the motto, "Gotta go fast," but revisiting his early games on the Sega Genesis, it reveals that this is a fallacy. Sonic was sold on his speed compared to Mario and other platformers, but he isn't actually any faster. From a standing start, running left to right, he's actually fairly slow and unresponsive compared to Mario's somewhat twitchy controls. It takes the Hedgehog a few moments to accelerate to his full speed. It is possible to move faster, but in order to do so the player needs to make use of their surroundings. Speed is not the point of the game, it's a reward for playing it well. The innovation that Sonic the Hedgehog brought to the market and spawned a franchise with, it wasn't speed, it was momentum. And this was accompanied by a vibrant soundtrack from Masato Nakamura, bassist from the Japanese band Dreams Come True. Another misconception of his early platform games is that the soundtrack's a selection of beeps and bops. In 2010, whilst attempting to hark back to the Hedgehog's glory days by trying to make a true sequel to the original 3 games, Jun Senu composed a bright and bouncy chiptune soundtrack which, in my opinion, completely misses the point of the originals. On the Mega Drive, the music was held back by the limitations of the hardware, but at all times it maintains this strong, heavy, this rhythmic beat that has either an up-tempo swing or a jazzy flair. There's always something interesting rhythmically going on, a panache so prominent it isn't completely surprising that it then caught Michael Jackson's attention. Revisiting video games of this era, it always strikes me that from this point onwards, it became much more common for characters to behave as though they had weight and presence in the world. The complex interaction between the sprites begins to indicate that this is not just a space within which players move around, but one where they physically engaged with and have an impact upon. Sonic is by no means solely responsible for this shift, but it is a landmark moment in the evolution of the genre. The 2D era of video games on the consoles waxed and waned in the 1990s. The rise of 3D graphics meant that this era came to a fairly ignoble end by the millennium, but recent indie games have harked back to the glory days of 2D platform gaming. In the intervening years, however, there was a wave of similar mascots designed to compete in the space between the Hedgehog and the Plumber. Bubsy, Aero, Awesome Possum, Mr. Nuts, Gex, Rocket Knight, and many more spawned in this game's wake. And with the rise of three-dimensional space, the Blue Hedgehog's fortune have been rather more mixed. But the original 2D Sonic the Hedgehog game was by no means the first great platformer to rival Mario, but it arguably was the first to revisit the fundamental mechanics of platform gaming. By introducing a truly responsive new engine that allowed free-flowing gameplay, it opened up new possibilities in level designs. Ideas that often sadly would not be truly explored until the sequels that worked off the concept this game introduced. I would encourage revisiting this, however, for the opening level, Green Hill Zone Act 1, when it was play-tested to the nth degree during this game's development, and it shows. The first level is a masterclass in design. Later levels are a mixed bag. Marble Zone and Labyrinth do everything in their power to slow the player down, direct them into narrow corridors or swamp them into dreaded underwater sections where the player's momentum is subbed. But it would not take Sonic Team long to expand upon this first attempt. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 arrived only a year later in 1992, and by then the team had perfected their vision. Larger and broader levels, with branching paths, designs more suited for Sonic's unique gameplay, and the innovation of the spin dash to make gathering that first burst of momentum easier. There were several sequels to Sonic the Hedgehog, and throughout the early 1990s, the template laid down by this game were built into a franchise that appeared unstoppable. There were comic books, adventure books, television series, anime, McDonald's toys. The blue blur got everywhere. In retrospect, I never feel the urge to revisit this original game. The Mega Drive sequels, and some 2D iterations since then, they do everything this one did but better. However, Sega keeps re-releasing the original entry because they recognise its cultural significance. Ports and remasters have been produced for the Sega Saturn, the PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, PC, Game Boy Advance, iOS, Nintendo DS, Wii, PSP, 3DS, Xbox 360, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, PC again, and Nintendo Switch. I've been capturing footage from a couple of these versions, but arguably it's difficult to recapture the magic of Sonic on his original console. Potentially, the 2013 Taxman and Stealth Mobile port with a game controller would be fantastic. Getting this remastered in widescreen would do so many favours to this game. Taking away the hardware limitations of the original without using emulation would be great, but at the moment there's been no luck getting that off the mobile phone ports. In Europe, Sega didn't just compete with Nintendo, but they overtook it, and a certain blue blur was prominently visible at the front of the charge. So when analysing the early days of video games, Sonic's arrival really was a significant moment in history, and one definitely worth checking out if you aren't familiar with it already. I told you the 1990s were weird. Have you ever grown frustrated with something that you're working on? Have you ever just wanted to tear something that you love, that you've put time and energy and passion into? Tear it apart, tear it down and watch it burn. Have you imagined what joy you would get from starting again fresh, renewed, purified, released from all the stress and the worries that were previously piling up, closing in on you, and burdening you down so much that you just felt like you could choke? Marvel Comics may not have felt like this when they handed the reins of their Avengers franchise to Jonathan Hickman in 2012, but he immediately began setting about the seeds for the destruction of everything that comic fans held dear. It took him 4 years, 89 issues, across 4 distinct series and a cast of hundreds, but in 2015 he carried out a masterclass in comic storytelling in the 6-part miniseries Secret Wars. This is Moments of Culture, and this is 2015, the year that Jonathan Hickman ended the Marvel Comic universe. Marvel Comics has a reputation for overselling big event comics, spectacular short runs of comic tie-ins that they claim will always change everything, but with each time they repeat this trick, it becomes less effective. Inevitably, things do not change that much, and although these comics do sell, the returns feel smaller and smaller. But with Secret Wars, the promise that everything changes was no lie. Jonathan Hickman picked up on the seeds he had laid down over 6 years earlier on his time writing for the Fantastic Four and the Ultimates comic lines. He continued storylines and themes that he'd embedded so deeply throughout his run that, when the dust settled, I felt no other sensation but the need to applaud the man for the audacity of what he had done. Approached in the right frame of mind, Secret Wars is a moment of grand catharsis. It weaves several tight plot threads together to a natural conclusion, where every moment feels grand, epic, but also natural to the characters. The emotional journey that anyone invested in these characters will feel as one by one each of them meets their end, until the end, everything dies, feels suitably epic on every scale. When looking for stories of comparable scale and scope, you really struggle to find many examples done as well as this. And for this short brief run, Jonathan Hickman shows that comics can transcend the stereotypes of their medium and present something that isn't just a comic book, isn't just a graphical novel. This is science fiction at its best. Now, it's important for historical context to remember that before 2012, The Avengers was not Marvel's premiere comic strip. In fact, until 2008, when the MCU started with Iron Man, these comics were considered fairly niche compared to the big hitters such as the X-Men and Spider-Man. But with the Joss Whedon directed Avengers movie, everything changed. These characters were suddenly not just important movie franchises in their own right, but the centre of the largest cinematic universe to ever grace our screens. And whilst Kevin Feige and his team were mapping out the next 7 years of their Infinity Saga, Jonathan Hickman was handed the reins to the comic book series it was all supposed to be based on. On December the 5th, and following for every 2 weeks after that, under the Marvel Now branding, his Avengers comic told stories designed to be bigger, bolder, and better than anything we had seen before. And like the MCU, it started with 2 key characters, Iron Man and Captain America. The Marvel Universe's greatest heroes leading the charge. But whilst the stories were bold, colourful, and fairly simplistic in nature, it was also immediately obvious that things weren't exactly the same as we had seen before. These were two great heroes, now familiar to audiences across the world for sustaining multi-million-dollar film franchises. On screen, they were antagonistic but friendly. A great double act to be sure, but this? It's certainly a bold panel to start a series like this, not with a flash or a bang, although those are found in great numbers throughout the run, but with what feels more like a church sermon. As the series got into its groove, it settled on a large, interstellar story where the Earth is endangered by a large cosmic event, and although Hickman assembles literally dozens of superheroes to counter this growing peril, he keeps things focused on his two central leads. It was the spark that started the fire, a legend that grew in the telling. The great idea was expansion, and it started with two men. One was life, and one was death. This is not how people at the time were thinking about Tony Stark and Steve Rogers, but it was intriguing. Things got simultaneously stranger and yet more clear when the Avengers comic strip was joined by a second parallel comic book, The New Avengers. Picking up an idea mooted several years earlier, this comic focused on a much smaller cast of characters, the Illuminati. A small clique within the larger superhero community, Hickman assembled a group of people who thought themselves above the rest. People prepared to look at the bigger picture. Whereas the cast of the Avengers was based off an expanded roster, it still focused on the key players familiar to the MCU: Iron Man, Captain America, Hulk, Thor, Black Widow, Hawkeye. The New Avengers starts with Black Panther, several years before he would eventually cross over to the cinema screens, and he assembles his own unique team to prevent an even greater threat: the end of all things. Through Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic from the Fantastic Four, it is explained to Iron Man, Captain America, Doctor Strange, also several years out from his cinema outings, Black Bolt and Namor, that the universe is ending. This isn't a dastardly plot by some scheming supervillain. This isn't a grave threat from beyond the stars. It is simple physics. Through some excellent high-concept scientific writing, Jonathan Hickman weaves a story about incursions, collisions between parallel universes that almost always end with one or the other wiping themselves out. Something has happened to trigger this process, and now that the multiverse itself is unwinding, each incursion shortening its lifespan and triggering the next, each moment the end of all things is accelerating. We are shown in horrific detail the outcomes of this as a new villain, Black Swan, flees the devastation and tearfully, but not particularly remorsefully, warns the Illuminati what is to come. The situation seems dire, and in the words of Mr. Fantastic himself, everything dies. You, me, everyone in this planet, our sun, our galaxy, and eventually the universe itself. This is simply how things are. It's inevitable, and I accept it. This comic book industry thrives on two things. Firstly, it thrives on a sense of danger and peril. For decades, the publishers at Marvel and DC have had the problem of escalating threat levels. Each baddie has to be bigger and badder than the last. Their plots and schemes have to be more epic and more impactful. How many times have we been told the stakes have never been higher? So perhaps at the time this didn't feel like such a large statement. The universe is always in peril. That's what superhero comics are about. Great men and great women doing great things to save the rest of us. But these comics kept repeating these mantras. Everything dies. It started with two men. One was life and one was death. Captain America, a figure of hope, was swiftly booted out of the New Avengers comics when the others wiped his mind to make him forget what they had done. He was too innocent, too pure to face up to what was coming. And so for several years there was a strange status quo, where one comic was full of life and hope and glorious fights where the greatest heroes of our age took on and beat down the worst villains the universe had to offer. Thanos, the Builders. But parallel to that, a small group of very smart and intelligent people were getting tenser and tenser as they perceived things to be beginning to fall apart. The end was coming. It was coming. The end was getting nearer, and they couldn't hide it anymore. We, the audience along for the ride, watched as the brutal reality hit, and the Avengers, as we thought we knew them, split down the middle. Unfortunately, at Marvel, several key things happen off-panel. Captain America is aged up to become an old man, and he hangs up his shield. Thor becomes unworthy and loses his hammer. See Jason Aaron's run on the Thor comics, and he is replaced by a woman. Tony Stark goes a little mental and dons a pure white suit. Reading the saga back from a modern perspective, these feel like niggling defects in what is otherwise a fairly complete run from Jonathan Hickman. In the moment, the idea of comic tie-ins is a great thing. It builds an interconnected universe, but in retrospect I have to say, it often just feels like it makes many collections feel incomplete. To try and get around this, Jonathan Hickman initiated a time skip of 5 months, so he had headspace to put his plans into action without worrying about what everyone else in Marvel was up to at the time. And at first this is a great annoyance, but the Time Runs Out saga, where the storyline is split equally across both comic lines, may have been Marvel's finest hour. Revelations begin dropping like bombshells as Jonathan Hickman manoeuvres the entire roster of Marvel heroes and villains into place. Doctor Strange goes on a journey to find the means of saving the multiverse. Doctor Doom has a secret plan that could impact everything. The Molecule Man, a figure from the great cataclysms of previous Marvel comics of yesteryear, is heavily implicated. Captain Britain appears from nowhere, driven mad by horrors he has seen in another universe. Reed Richards is on the run, hunted by S.H.I.E.L.D. and his wife for the ultimate betrayal. The Maker, a truly horrific villain from an alternative universe within Marvel Comics, reappears, teamed up with Thanos and a group of villains all of their own making. The bitter feud between Namor and Black Panther that was so integral to this run boils to a head. The universe, nay the multiverse itself, is ending, and Iron Man and Captain America are just too angry with each other to care. The sky literally begins to fall in, and all they care about is who lied to who. And so ended Jonathan Hickman's run on the Avengers, with Captain America beating 7 shades out of Tony Stark whilst demanding, "I want to hear you say it. I want to hear you say you lied." Both men staring with hatred into each other's eyes as a spaceship comes crashing down from above. One was life, one was death, and one always wins. Everything dies. 2 parallel comics that, from the outside, appeared so different, but ultimately were one single story. And it could have ended there, a sour, pessimistic, horrific point of view and meditation on the pointlessness of life. But the journey had been fantastic. Jonathan Hickman had served a deconstruction of the very concept of superheroes, men and women who put themselves above everyone else, who stand tall against threats and say, "I will protect you, I will stand firm." He had shown them at their greatest in the Infinity miniseries, where Earth's mightiest heroes literally saved the universe. But then, just a few months and years later, he tore them to their lowest ever point. What do people like this do when faced with no-win scenarios? How do they cope when it all comes crashing down around them? Well, the simple answer was, many of them don't. At the time, Iron Man and Captain America were being idolised as the faces of the world's most profitable film franchise to the silver screen. They were laying into each other with genuine fury on the comic pages. Their story at this point was over. And so begins Secret Wars, at the end of all things. In 2015, to cap off his run and complete his grand tale, Jonathan Hickman was afforded a final 9 issues to put it all right. Because the other things besides peril that comic books thrive on is the idea that nothing should ever change, or at the least, changes must always be incremental. DC and Marvel have a pretty set roster. At each point in time, some characters may be in and some characters may be out, but the cast remains largely the same. Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, Wolverine, Iron Man, Thor, Hulk. Every writer and artist will depict them going through massive upheavals in their life. But ultimately, although there is the appearance of change, in the end, the status quo must be restored. In 2015, Jonathan Hickman's time was up, and he sadly had to return his toys to the box, and try to leave them in a, if not exactly the same state, a comparable one to how he found them. So Secret Wars is a 9-issue masterclass in endings. The very first issue feels a little out of place when read in isolation, as it is the capstone of his Avengers run. It is the final moments of two dying universes facing annihilation together. It is the battle between two desperate armies, both fighting for survival, mostly unaware that their battles are meaningless compared to what is to come. It is the survivors struggling through this war zone, desperate to find a place of safety. It is the end of two continuities that had been running since 1961 and 2000, respectively. The fact that Jonathan Hickman manages to carry this off in a manner respectful to everything that came before is outstanding. Two main figures from before are gone. Tony Stark and Iron Man's story is over, and their growing hatred for each other had been played out. It was picked up again in some tie-in comics, but in this case it is ultimately inconsequential. Throughout Hickman's run, there has never been enough space to give justice to all of the characters. Some tales are painted through small pictures, a panel here, a throwaway line there, a comment from a third party. Often some of these part tales, such as the sudden appearance of Captain Britain and Hank Pym in the Time Runs Out storyline, feel especially truncated, as these are not characters we've had the luxury of time with. They appear, do their thing, then are put aside. At his worst, Hickman's writing can expose these characters as mere ciphers and plot contrivances, designed to advance us to the next story beat. And yet, in a tale as epic as this, it feels churlish to demand more details that would inevitably destroy the pacing. Despite the epic scope and majesty, this is a story that moves at a fair pace throughout its 4-year run. Instead, the story focuses on the survivors, the ones who did not lose their heads as the world came to an end, but somehow found a way to survive. Reed Richards and Dr. Doom, Jonathan Hickman's protagonists from his early days working within the Marvel Universe, are front and centre, but along for the ride are significant story beats for Doctor Strange, Namor and Black Panther, Thanos and the Maker, two different Spider-Men, and so many, many, many more. The concept is both fantastical and simple. The universe has ended, but by sheer force of will and plot contrivances that had been spread out over 3 years of planning, Dr. Doom has saved a vestige of what was lost. He has recreated a small portion of the prior universe, a small fragment of populations who live with him as their god and master. He is both the villain and the hero of the piece, because it is simultaneously about his ego driving him to demand obedience and worship from those he saved, whilst at the same time acknowledging that, if he hadn't saved them, there would be nothing left to save at all. There are a few issues, and several annoying tie-ins that I don't recommend searching for, setting up this world, and then several more that show what happens when it all comes crashing down around Doom's ears. What happens when other survivors from the incursions that ended reality as we know it escape into his refuge? What happens when people refuse to bow before their god? And what happens when Mr. Fantastic, his old nemesis from the very early days of comic history, asks why his wife, Sue Richards, thinks that she is Doom's consort? Did Doom save the universe because he was great and good? Or was he just jealous of the love and affection his old adversary enjoyed? I don't want to spoil the ending, but the concept that such a large, metaphysical science fiction battle boils down to a single argument, a conversation, and an enmity between two people is fitting. And while Steve Rogers and Tony Stark's final moments were found wanting, the final moments between Doom and Reed Richards is both upbeat and prophetic. Sadly, this was something of a temporary end for the Fantastic Four in Marvel Comics. The strips ceased to exist, and it would be another 2 years before there were conversations about Reed or Sue returning to the Marvel Universe. Some people blame the fact that Marvel and Disney did not own the film rights to these characters, and say this was done to spite Fox. Certainly the mid-2000s were low points for the X-Men and Fantastic Four franchises, respectively. Two of the great bastions of the comic book industry found themselves eclipsed by newer, bigger stars. Secret Wars did everything though. It threw out dozens of years of Marvel continuity and put it back down in a very ambiguous state. Everyone and everything that people loved inside these comics was back, but they felt different. They felt fresher, less encumbered by years of backstory. The incursion events set about by Jonathan Hickman acted as a purifying flame to the drama and plot twists going on behind the scenes. Theoretically, writers, previously trapped by competing story beats from a dozen other authors, all battling out at the same time for audience attention, could use this new sense of freedom to explore new avenues. How things went from here is another story though. Secret Wars was not a beginning, and it did not lead to a future renaissance for Marvel comic books. Jonathan Hickman walked away and left the ball for others to pick up. This was an ending, a full stop on one of the greatest stories Marvel had ever told. Epic, grand, intensely personal, and expertly plotted. And now, in a world that has lived through the MCU apotheosis with Infinity War, however, beware. I would not encourage people to start with this book. Please consider starting with Jonathan Hickman's prior.
Hi, how are you doing? Look, I know it's been a long time since we last spoke, and I've been thinking about how much it sucks when you miss your friends. And I thought I could keep busy playing Kingdom Hearts, take my mind off it, but it seems to have really backfired. Because the guys at Square Enix and Disney, they really want me to know how much it sucks when you miss your friends. It's a message that they can't help but hammer home right the way throughout this really weird, originally a PS2 game but ported to modern platforms, and they really won't let this message go. Kingdom Hearts is a really odd video game, and I want to try and work out why it's taken on such a weird cultural identity. This game really became a phenomenon, and I don't think it's what anyone was expecting. If you sell it to you and say, oh, it's a game with Disney characters and Final Fantasy characters, the Disney license in the hands of the RPG masters of the genre Square Enix, only it's not a traditional JRPG video game. It's more of an action adventure. It should not work on paper, but somehow the creators really struck a nerve and it sticks with you. I finished playing it over a week ago for the second time. The first time I played it was back when it originally came out on the PlayStation 2. I've been lucky enough to get a chance to replay it, and it sticks with you. I remembered so many of the scenes that I've carried away with that memory in my heart all these years. And it, as I said, on paper it just should not work. But the game puts you in control of this character called Sora. He's not a Disney or a Square Enix traditional character. He's brand new for the game, and he's growing up on this little island. And after a really bizarre CGI opening sequence, which in retrospect actually covers the plot of the game quite successfully, although the first time you see it, you're just like, what is this weirdness? Because it has your friend standing in the ocean, and then he disappears and you're knocked over by this tidal wave. But then your other friend helps you up, but then you fall through you see yourself falling from the sky in the distance. While you're trying to work out why there's a copy of you falling from the sky, suddenly the ground underneath gives out and your friend reaches out to try and hold on to you, but she can't get you, so you go plummeting, and then you are the person in the sky falling into darkness. Yeah, and then you land surrounded by this image of one of the ancient Disney princesses in this black void of nothingness. That sounds like nonsense, but it's actually almost a perfect metaphor for the story of the game, all encapsulated within 2 minutes with this funky J-pop soundtrack, which is also gets in your head and you can't get away from. But yeah, you control Sora, this original creation, and his two friends, Kairi and Riku, and it's a perfect encapsulation of childhood play. You know, you're on this beach. It's a lovely little picturesque scenario. Nothing else in the world matters, just the little game and the fun, how great it is to hang out with your friends and live this little life. And then within an hour, before you actually have a chance to get settled where you are, it's all taken away from you. The world is consumed by this black darkness. You see Riku, your main buddy, who's kind of had this like a competitive streak with you throughout the whole introduction, and he's been racing you and battling you, and sort of this competitive gameplay streak. He reaches out to say, I want to go and explore other worlds. I'm fed up being stuck here. I'm not a kid anymore. I want to grow up. I want to go and see what the world has to offer. But you can't follow him. And then you go after Kyrie, your other friend, who you're scared about what's going to happen to the two of you, and she disappears. And the world is swallowed by darkness, and you're dumped in this other new location called Traverse Town, where a couple of characters from the Final Fantasy games say welcome and explain to you that your world's been swallowed by darkness and you're now a refugee, living trapped in another world with no way home. It sounds really bleak, it sounds really dark, and it really would be, apart from to counterbalance all this, whilst horrible introduction was going on, we get this comedic sequence where Donald Duck and Goofy walk in on Mickey Mouse, who's now a king for some reason. He's very rarely depicted as a king outside the Final Fantasy games, but no, now he's a monarch. He rules this little kingdom. But the two of them go to visit him, and they find this little note saying, I'm really sorry, the stars have been going out, I need to solve it. And Mickey Mouse takes it upon himself to fix this by disappearing. And he leaves Donald and Goofy, who are falling over themselves in this little comedic sequence, trying to hide the fact Mickey Mouse has gone missing, and they have to follow him from their respective partners, Daisy Duck and Minnie Mouse. Goofy doesn't have a partner. He must be very lonely. So they get sent on this quest, sent by King Mickey, to find the Keyblade bearer, who happens to be Sora, because when the world got swallowed by darkness, he found this mysterious key. And that's what you do for the majority of this game. It's a 40, maybe nearly 40-hour long game where you hold this giant key that's the size of a sword, and you just beat these little black monsters over the head with a giant sword. It really is, it's crazier than it sounds. It's not as crazy as it sounds, it gets worse. So Donald and Goofy come to Traverse Town on this little spaceship made of not Lego blocks, because Lego aren't part of this game, they're called gummy blocks, but they're Lego blocks. So you and your not Lego spaceship, Donald and Goofy, go out to try and find Riku, Kairi and King Mickey. And the only reason you're pairing up initially is because you have the Keyblade, but across the course of 40 hours or so, Donald and Goofy will really become your best friends in the world. And so the three of you go on this little adventure through all of the other different kingdoms that Square Enix had the license to use from Disney. And they're mostly not, I mean, this is a game that came out not too long after the Millennium, so they're mostly 90s era Disney movies. We've got Agrabah from Aladdin, we've got Atlantica from The Little Mermaid, you've got the Tarzan movie and the Deep Jungle from there. The Beast from Beauty and the Beast turns up, but there's some older franchises as well. There's Winnie the Pooh. He's not a world, he's this character in a little book that you can enter, and because all the pages of the book have been torn out, you have to find the pages, put the book back together, and then you can become friends with Winnie the Pooh and Rabbit and Eeyore and Tigger and the gang. But all of the other places are worlds that you go to, and it's like, you know, when you haven't got any friends you can go out and play with, what can you do? Well, you stick a Disney movie on, and for a couple of hours just immerse yourself in this little vibrant worlds, distractions that Disney's been producing for over a century now. You can chill out with these 90s era. As I said, there's some older ones. There's as well as Winnie the Pooh, you've got Peter Pan, and you've got these little references to older franchises as well. So Dumbo is a character you can summon. But all of these characters, you visit their worlds, and Sora, Donald and Goofy get caught up because these people have their own problems. Life's not simple for any of us. All of these worlds have a little cast of characters in them with stuff that's going on which is just not fun. And so Sora's a nice guy. He gets a little bit ratty at first because he's upset that he just wants to see Riku and Kairi, and he doesn't see why he should get involved in all this other stuff. But pretty quickly he becomes to realize that he life would be better if he just embraces these. So he goes out, meets these groups of people, helps them out for a bit, but ultimately they've got their problems, he's got his. What he cares about are his friends, and it's nice to meet new people. It's nice to go out and hang about and do something different and get a change of scenery. One minute you're in the desert and Agrabah and it's all nice, but you get bored of that. So just hop on over and you can be in the deep jungle and hang out with Tarzan instead. It's great, but it's not what you want to be doing. What you want is to find your friends. You want Riku and you want Kairi. And Riku comes pretty quickly, actually. He's not gone missing. He was actually found by Maleficent from Sleeping Beauty. She's this horrible witch woman who tells him that she can help him get what he wants, but he has to do stuff for her. So Riku sort of accidentally, by his own means, becomes this minion of Maleficent, and he follows Sora around watching him, getting annoyed that Sora's made friends, when what Riku's done is he's made friends with Maleficent and Sora's made friends with Donald and Goofy. But Riku seems to be very jealous of the fact Sora's made friends, even he feels replaced, even though he's also done exactly the same thing. So Riku eventually he tries to kidnap Pinocchio, who's been swallowed by the whale Monstro, because Pinocchio is a wooden boy, doesn't have a heart, and Maleficent tells him, or he does have a heart, but it's not a normal. Maleficent tells him that he needs stuff like this to try and get Kairi back, because Kairi, it turns out, her heart's been swallowed by the darkness. The weird, completely unexpected, but the weird thing is there are 7 princesses of heart who are taken from across the different Disney movies. You've got Sleeping Beauty, Belle from Beauty and the Beast, Jasmine, who you get to see kidnapped from Aladdin, Alice from Alice in Wonderland, she gets kidnapped from Interview. As you go through your adventure, you sort of discover and get these hints of what Maleficent's doing. But only when you reach the final world do you really understand that what's actually going on is that Maleficent has been gathering these princesses together so she can open this great gateway to Kingdom Hearts, which is... the meta plot is weird. Before any of us were alive, theoretically in an ancient bygone day, everything was great. There was a lot of light in the world, but then darkness and despair started to spread, and so people locked the greatest light away to try and hide the shadows. And Maleficent wants to find the way back into that light because it will give her power and the means to control other people, presumably. It's never really explored. But just as she is on the verge of opening Kingdom Hearts, Riku gets possessed by this voice from behind the void, and you realise it's a voice you've heard before. A voice spoke to you before your world was destroyed, telling you that your world had been connected to the darkness, and throughout your adventure you've been sealing off different doors and different worlds to prevent the other worlds being connected to the darkness and destroyed. So at the very end, you go through this void. Maleficent is consumed by the darkness, Riku betrays her, but then he's possessed by this voice, who reveals that he was Ansem. Ansem, again, brand new character. As much as it relies on the Disney and the Final Fantasy cast of characters as a marketing crux, this game doesn't rely them on as a crutch to get you invested in the story. The stuff you really care about is original to this game. The stuff you really care about is Sora, Kairi and Riku and the emotional journey they go on. But it all culminates with Ansem as the Seeker of Darkness, this new and original character, declaring that there is essentially no hope, no point in living. We should just submit to the darkness, which is essentially a metaphor for despair and hopelessness. And if we just accept that our lives are going to be miserable, then we can move beyond that. We can use that acceptance of darkness and power to be stronger. But it's not a positive worldview, it's a horrible philosophy. And so Sora really stands up as the champion of the light. He momentarily succumbs to darkness, but he finds his way. He finds his way out of despair, and he reconnects with Kairi and Donald and Goofy. And because this is a rather sexist young boy, and girls, got to be protected. You can't let them see danger at all. Girls are not there to take part in adventures. They're there to be protected. Having rescued Kairi as this damsel in distress, deposits her in Traverse Town with the Final Fantasy characters he met and made friends with there, and says, no, I can't stay in Traverse Town. I would have hated it here. This is a horrible place, not my home. I don't want to be here. So I'm going to go on this adventure, but you're too precious. Stay in Traverse Town. It's not as bad as I'm making it out to be, but it's there. And so Sora goes back. He, Donald and Goofy go through the world to darkness. They confront Ansem, who has fully possessed Riku from this point, and they fight him to try and save Riku's soul. But it's too late. Ansem opens the door to Kingdom Hearts, fully expecting this giant darkness to engulf out and give him the power to conquer the universe. But no, Sora gives this long speech about I know in my heart that beyond the door is not darkness but light. And also Mickey Mouse and Riku. The Mickey Mouse is not in this game at all until the final cutscene, when you see his ears, and he has a Keyblade as well. He just pops up on the far side of this door and goes, "Let there be light." But there's darkness as well as light behind the door, so close the door, don't let the darkness out. But Ansem is consumed by the light, disappeared. All of the worlds which were consumed by darkness are freed when this door is open. So Destiny Islands, this little island where you grew up on, it reconvenes, and there's a horrifying, terrible final cutscene where Kairi goes back to her world. Sora reaches out to grab her hand, not to go with her, just because he wants to hold her hand, but he can't make it. So Kairi goes back to where she came from, returns to Destiny Island and all their other friends there, but Sora is left on his own. But it's not this isn't a game about despair. There's hope. Kairi is back home, but Riku and King Mickey are still lost. So Sora, Donald and Goofy, they have their mission. They're going to go and find Mickey Mouse and Riku, and there will be sequels. And it's beautiful. And it's not what the game sells itself as. It sells it as this romp through the little Disney kingdoms. But the Disney kingdoms are these fleeting experiences, and most of them are not that impressive. The Olympus Colosseum from Hercules, that's not a world so much as a series of boss rush trials where you just fight round after round of different enemies. Alice in Wonderland is this confusing, there's this one room where the Queen of Hearts is putting people on trial, but most of it's just wandering around this confusing little jungle, which is simultaneously really small, but also far, far, far too complicated in the way it lays itself out. Some of the later worlds look quite interesting. There's a great riff on The Nightmare Before Christmas and Jack Skellington, and a lot of these characters will join your party temporarily. So Tarzan, Aladdin, Jack Skellington, Peter Pan, you can sub out either Donald or Goofy, get them to join you in their respective worlds, and it's absolutely great to be fighting with Peter Pan by your side, and he teaches you the ability to fly. So within Neverland you can fly like Peter Pan can, and when you leave Neverland, even though you can't fly, you can still sort of glide around, so you can reach areas you couldn't reach before, so there's a bit of exploration. You level up as you go along, so initially you're just bashing people over the head with this giant key, but as you go on you get more and more techniques. Sora becomes this whirling dervish of keyblades spinning everywhere and magic attacks. You can cast fire or lightning or water attacks, or create this little whirlwind of arrow to protect himself from damage. It takes a long time to level up. The initial gameplay I didn't enjoy that much, but by the end I was grinning to ear to ear. This is a really, really fun game to play, and it's a really fun game to listen to as well. The composer is called Yoko Shimomura, and there are some Disney songs, but not as many as you'd expect at all. This is mostly stuff that feels like it's taken from a Disney movie, but it's actually, there's a lot of original stuff in it, and the original stuff is really good. It's, as I said it before, it's bookended by this J-pop Japanese song called Simple and Clean, which is an earworm, but there's also this terrible melancholic piano riff called Dearly Beloved, and just all of the song comes back to this central theme. It's horrible when you're missing your friends and you want to see them again, but you play it for the meaning. It's that the little messages behind these characters really, really drag me in. It's great. I can't recommend Kingdom Hearts enough, but I'm not recommending it because of the Disney characters. It uses them in the best way possible. Sora, Kairi, Riku, Ansem, okay, he's not the best bad guy in the world, and he just has this catchphrase, darkness. Everything's about darkness with him. But I really recommend, if you've got a couple of spare hours and you want to see what the philosophy of despair and neglect and how you can use nostalgia to hold off melancholy, but it itself is not enough. If you want to see all of that, but through the eyes with which a 10 to 15-year-old kid can get their head behind, this is a marvellous experiment.
The fantasy genre is one that regularly goes through phases. Different styles of storytelling come in and out of fashion. I personally have had little interest in defining out the difference between high or epic fantasy compared to low fantasy, magical realism, sword and sorcery stories, fables, or urban fantasy. To me, a good story is a good story. I can see the point in working with a set of common conventions and audience expectations. Writing to a specific audience allows for opportunities to simplify your storytelling, to speed up your pacing, or perhaps tinker with audience expectations. I want books and stories that can surprise me in whatever genre I am reading. 2008 was an extremely interesting year for Brandon Sanderson. The Hero of Ages was his fourth published book with US publisher Tor Books, who had accepted his original manuscript Elantris and commissioned him for a 3-book series to follow it up. Mistborn, The Final Empire, was published in 2006, and the 2 sequels came fast. The Well of Ascension and The Hero of Ages each only came a year apart. The author had planned all 3 stories out in advance, and although each is designed to be a satisfactory read alone, there is no denying a solid through line connects all 3. These are dense tomes, all full of surprises and twists that will take even the most hardened fantasy reader by surprise. In his own words, as soon as he had a publisher on board, he wanted to write a calling card to fantasy readers, a trilogy they could read through and get a feel for who he was and what his writing was like. That calling card would turn out to be extremely important for fans of the genre, in a way they could never have expected. 2007 marked the sad passing of acclaimed epic fantasy author Robert Jordan, who had died 12 books into the unfinished epic series Wheel of Time. Robert Jordan was a titan in the fantasy publishing genre, and he had been working on this series, chronicling the journey of Randolph War from country bumpkin to a mad god king of a world in the middle of an epic war since January 1990. His readers were desperate to know if the series would ever be completed, and in December 2007, Robert Jordan's wife Harriet announced she had chosen Brandon Sanderson to complete her husband's work. Why Brandon Sanderson, people asked. There were many reasons given, and also none specifically. And so, when Heroes of Ages was published in 2008, completing Brandon Sanderson's first trilogy, he had a legion of avid readers from the established franchise turn to scrutinise his work to a degree that other fledgling fantasy writers can only dream of. The question is, was this original work found wanting? Each book in the original Mistborn trilogy is extremely different in tone. Throughout all of them there are mysteries and a progressive sense of discovery, and protagonist Vin learns more about the culture and society of the Final Empire. The setting is post-apocalyptical, a ruined wasteland of a world where humanity has suffered through the Dark Ages, surviving under the heel of a tyrannical Lord Ruler who has split society into 2. The Final Empire is a gripping read. The story moves at a fantastic pace as Vin is brought into the crew and trained for her part in the heist. Brandon Sanderson sets up an interesting magic system based on consuming and then burning precious metals. Consuming different metals allows people to fly, to increase their senses, to affect people's emotions and manipulate crowds, or to just make someone really, really strong. The power is supposed to be a noble trait, but almost everyone in the crew has at least one skill, and Vin and Kelsey are able to burn any metal, making them full Mistborns. Brandon Sanderson has considered the implications of this magical system and the physics thereof in exquisite detail, and he writes with considerable poise each and every one of these powers, constructing scenarios and settings to show off his creation to the reader like a stage magician slowly unveiling his cards one at a time. That isn't to say this is not an emotional book. Vin is an orphan, abandoned by her brother, left only with an earring to remember her family. Her journey from frightened refugee to a living weapon of destruction is told in intimate detail. Kelsey, who sets her onto this path, is a widow burning with righteous fury at the wrongs done to him. Everyone in this story has suffered in one way or another, and the book spends time exploring how people who have been hurt so badly find the strength to come together to do something about it. There is a large and complex cast, but ultimately the tale revolves around Vin determining who and what she is, Kelsey's secrets, and a young noble Ellen Venture's determination to be a good man faced with impossible odds. This, at times, is a particularly gruesome series, with several points of imagery that are disturbing or distasteful. There are gruesome depictions of men and women with pieces of metal rammed through their bodies, people who have their eyes gouged out, or are forced to suffer extreme psychological tortures. This is not a horror series. The author's intent is often not to deliberately shock or freak out or intimidate the readers. This is more of a thorough thought experiment about the consequences of a world where power and metal are linked. Not everybody has the power of a Mistborn, and it seems obvious that over generations, society would search for other ways to redistribute inequality. There are elements of Kelsier and Vin's journey which are distinctly unsuitable for children or people of a sensitive disposition. But whilst it can be gruesome, it can also be beautiful. Brandon Sanderson describes the motion and movement of people imbued with supernatural powers as though they were poetry in motion, somehow treading a fine line, combining both the mathematical precision and high artistry of this piece of work. The task set on Vin, Kelsier and the crew is immense. The setting is dire, but through Kelsier's machinations, Brandon Sanderson plots a story depicting the downfall of a tyrant. And halfway through the book, things really pick up. Because the thing about Brandon Sanderson, above any other fiction writer I've read in recent years, is that he really knows how to do endings. Most stories have a beginning, a middle and an end. The story is set, it progresses, and then things come to a natural conclusion. However, in a good Sanderson book, the advancement from the middle to the end is like a succession of loops on a roller coaster. These books are densely plotted, with layers and layers of mystery, plot twists and character choices that, although they take time to set up, once the action does start, the story accelerates to a nail-biting finale. Chapter after chapter, page after page, revelation after revelation, more facts, secrets and surprises are thrown at the reader, most of which upturn everything we thought we knew about the story. Kelsier, the Lord Ruler, Sazed, the heist, the rebellion. There are secrets and revelations about all of these, and once the floodgates open, the last third of the story roars along to an epic finale, which is perhaps why the second book can feel like a disappointment. There is a lot to enjoy about The Well of Ascension, but sadly the process of rebuilding the plot, of laying new story threads and introducing new characters slows the pace right back to a crawl. Jumping straight from the Final Empire to The Well of Ascension can be jarring because the first was so tightly plotted and had so much momentum when it ended, and then the second feels as though it's meandering. It isn't. It's very directed, but it feels as though it is. Because without announcing his intention, Brandon Sanderson has switched genres. The first story was about a heist. The second is more of a Cold War thriller. It's set in a land on the brink of war. It explores the politics and the psychology of cold-blooded killers trying to do what they need to keep the situation contained. Kill a few people here, silence someone there, all done to stop the full-scale massacre that an outright war would bring. Grit your teeth and carry on, because there's hope at the end. In this book, Ellen Venture is promoted from a small love interest to a major protagonist. He becomes king of a doomed kingdom and sets about installing a political democracy, accidentally undermining his own rule at the exact point when the people need clear direction. Some reviewers criticise the length of time spent discussing the merits of political intrigue, but I can see why these choices are made. It is not clear yet that the world is doomed, and by spending time discussing the sort of society that the Final Empire could become, Brandon Sanderson retains the illusion of hope. If the characters are smart enough, if they figure out the politics and secret mysteries of the Lord Ruler's power, if they fight hard enough and don't give in, it feels like there still is a future. It isn't until the third book, The Hero of Ages, that the truth sets in. This is a doomed world. The Lord Ruler's motivations were not at all what we thought they were. He may have been an egotistical tyrant, but he was also doing his best to hold the world together. The Mistborn universe truly is one of gods and monsters, and the revelations in this final book, which recast everything that came in the first two books, took my breath away. The Hero of Ages, which abandons the political machinations of the second book, becomes a full-on war story. It features the perfect embodiment of an all-powerful foe who cannot be beaten, who cannot be fought, who cannot be negotiated, and they cannot be stopped. The setting and the scenarios mesh perfectly. It is all tied together so effortlessly. The means of Vin's foe's plan and his eventual defeat were sewn all the way back in the opening chapters of the Final Empire, but we never noticed. To say too much more would spoil the effect, but the conclusion of the Hero of Ages left readers in no doubt what Brandon Sanderson was all about. In his final line, he teased that this grand story was just a small part of a larger epic still to be told, the saga of Adonalsium. As soon as this book was published, he set about working on the concluding chapters of the Wheel of Time, before returning to his own books. We now have a name for his series. He has announced that most of his books are interconnected in a shared universe that he has termed the Cosmere. Elantris and Mistborn were shortly followed by Warbreaker and then a new fantasy epic, the Stormlight Archive, a series of mammoth doorstopper books that redefine scope in epic fantasy. There were plans for Mistborn sequels that have borne fruit, for sequel series set 100 years later, and a prequel tie-in book relating Kelsier's behind-the-scenes antics. There have been Mistborn card games, audiobooks, plans for a video game, but nothing as yet. The Mistborn trilogy from Brandon Sanderson is a modern fantasy epic worthy of your time. It allowed Brandon Sanderson to stamp his own mark on the genre, proving his own worth before he stepped up to complete Robert Jordan's magnum opus. It has flaws and issues, but I would heartily recommend it for any fan of exciting and imaginative fiction. Okay, I'm going to have to say a Swedish word today, which is apparently supposed to be pronounced Knytt. But I've been replaying a game I knew as Knytt Underground for 8 years now, and as I don't speak a word of Swedish, and the game developer has gone on record for he isn't sensitive about the pronunciation, so I'm just going to say Knytt. Nicholas Niflas Nygren, again, apologies for pronunciation, is a Swedish video game designer who got his big break following the release of several small freeware games, developing a personal house style and a small but sincere fanbase who really adored what he was producing. In 2012, he would release his latest and greatest game onto a video game console to try and find a larger audience. What had begun for him initially as a hobby, just a guy learning by doing, developed into this sprawling, labyrinthine puzzle game that it completely defies explanation. How can I describe Knytt Underground? I think it does a fairly good job at doing it before you even reach the title screen. From the second the game loads, the player has control of a shadowed avatar, and though you can jump straight up into the title screen, new players are probably just going to hold right and then they'll fall down into this pit. What follows is a short loop where you're sent back to the left, then right again, jumping over some pits, then down, over to the left, climb upwards, all the way back over until you eventually find yourself above where you started. Once you've dropped back down, you head right, and then finally reach the title screen. Knytt Underground. A game that fundamentally is about getting from A to B, but where you'll usually have to hunt for a route as there is no direct or clear path to follow. The journey, not the destination, the journey is important. And this is what that gaming is all about. The importance of the journey is the importance of the gameplay, of the mechanics. This is a platform game. Niflas appears to be a purist. He gets gaming, and he values this kind of intricate design to ensure the player is constantly engaged. Others have waxed lyrical about the importance of World 1.1 and the original Super Mario Bros., which provides an invisible tutorial about how the game, and Mario himself, will work. Knytt Underground takes this philosophy and then extrapolates on it in a brilliant way. I'm always wary of describing games behind an indie label, considering that the genre and the effective scope of the game should be judged on its own merits, rather than by the publisher behind it. But Knytt Underground is the kind of game that challenges even that. It consistently turns its own way, sometimes to the detriment of the overall experience, but always in ways that justify its own strange sense of self-identity. Right from the start, it lies to you, describing itself as a 3-chapter game. Chapters 1 and 2 are just training levels. They're small, self-contained set pieces designed to help you acclimatise to the strange world of Knytt Underground and the seemingly entirely disparate control mechanisms of me, walk, jump and climb, and Bob, bounce. Each chapter ends suddenly, entirely unsatisfactory some might say, but this is just an introduction to the most important theme of Knytt Underground. Throughout the game, which is chapter 3, you will be asked to go on pointless fetch quests, to carry out minor objectives and missions that the game flat out admits are just there to get in your way, to give you something to do. On quite few of these, not so minor inconveniences, you return to the quest giver to find they have vanished, and even when they remain present, the paltry reward is hardly worth the effort. Right from the start, the game is making a point about the genre, towing a difficult line between parody whilst becoming one of the worst examples of what it's taken the mick of. It does, however, raise an interesting question. Do you do this for the tangible rewards, or for the sense of self-accomplishment, or just because you enjoy doing it? All the way back in 2012, 5 years before Hollow Knight would follow and tread a similar path and successfully break through that indie glass ceiling to reach mainstream appeal, the similarities and potential between Knytt Underground and that masterpiece are uncanny. Both star a diminutive hero exploring a vast underground labyrinth, caverns which require platforming expertise to be tested to the limit in order to proceed and navigate. This vast world of both are sparsely populated by other tiny microscopic creatures, in this case mainly sprites and fairies, but there are a few sentient bugs, who inhabit what remains of a ruined world long after some ill-defined catastrophe. This is not to take anything away from Team Cherry, who introduced extremely tight combat mechanics, a Metroidvania upgrade system, boss fights against increasingly dangerous foes, and beautiful artistic graphics. There's a reason why it got as popular as it did. Hollow Knight had mainstream appeal and a level of polish that is unmistakable. But whilst Team Cherry are exactly that, a team, though we had collaborators, it's clear to see that Knytt Underground is a game of a very singular vision from one very keen-eyed individual. Nifflas was able to create a game that has pure charm, excellent puzzles, and lots of content. There are over 1,800 rooms in total, probably less than a third of which are actual puzzles, but it puts you in the middle of one of the largest and most well-defined labyrinths in the history of platform gaming. And for anyone who loved the exploration element of Hollow Knight, I could recommend this as a progenitor of the genre any day. If you give yourself time to acclimatise past the basic and black geometries through which you must climb and bounce your way, this is a beautiful, immersive world that, despite showcasing some of the most basic programming video games today, can arguably be said to feel just as alive as some open AAA blockbusters. The writing is deceptively simple. It certainly didn't win any awards for its coarse and basic humour, but it draws the players in with as little pointless faff as possible. The limited cast do have some interesting depth to them if time is taken to explore, but Nifflas shows little interest in foisting narrative onto players who aren't interested. What is here is more a parody than a serious attempt to tell an interesting narrative, but at its heart is the call to adventure. The world is in peril. You must head to the 6 bells of fate hidden around the map to save it. Only almost half of the game's cast don't really believe the world actually is ending and just think the player is exploring these caverns because it's fun to do so. And there will be a lot of exploring. The map is simply humongous and it takes hours to find every nook and cranny and secret. While some people will complain it's both sparse and all the same, I can say that this is gaming in its purest, most simplified form. Navigation of a world map with occasional puzzle rooms that can test either mental skill, quick reflexes or both, using 2 entirely separate physics engines, platforming or bouncing. It's usually a pretty chill experience, but there will be moments of thrill in there. And whilst the foreground is always dark and foreboding, the simple and beautiful background art and the music are both distant and splendid, full of little touches and flourishes designed to both amuse and inspire. Control-wise, things are a little sketchy, challenging but not impossible, particularly when trying to navigate the unpredictable bouncing ball around some very dangerous areas. I really don't know why I fell in love with Knytt Underground. It throws the challenges and quests at you purely because that provides more opportunities for gameplay. It does this blatantly and with no apology. Some quest givers just outright state they are doing it because they can, and they make no apology for barring your way and sending you back with additional challenges before you can proceed. There is always another quest. In other genres, we would call this padding, but what Knytt does, though, is spark an argument about what the difference is between padding and content. Surely it's all content. Surely if it isn't a game, it is designed to be played. Perhaps the world is ending. Perhaps it isn't. But if you want to play a video game about exploring a vast network of caverns with some excellent platforming challenges, then go ahead and do it. You will find some surprises on the way. And for a few dozen hours, I was completely entranced. I've been wondering, what is parody or satire? Is it love and affection for the source material, or is it a sign of exhaustion and irritation at common tropes? Is it both? And if so, how do you manage to juggle the combination in such a way that you end up with something new? So many creators seem to struggle to toe this line, but perhaps the greatest proof that it can not just be done, but done well, is Discworld. 32 years of work producing 41 award-winning books, numerous short stories, graphic novels, stage, radio and film adaptations, a cast of the most beloved characters in fiction, and many, many sharp, critical indictments of almost every aspect of modern society. Discworld is a fantasy series that managed the incredible feat of breaking into the international mainstream culture, and it's remarkable that it all came from the head of just one man. There are many ways to experience Sir Terry Pratchett's first entry to the Discworld universe. In all probability, it's for the best that I went about it in a really unorthodox way. The sad truth is that this literary beast, an ongoing series that has over many years grown to become something of Herculean proportions, started out as something fairly simple, trivially light and lacking in many key areas. As a teenager, I first discovered the Discworld in the form of a graphic novel. It was an excellent adaptation which brings an extraordinary level of light and colour to the vivid world that Pratchett had conceived. As a comic strip, the adventures of Rincewind and Twoflower, well, they're episodic in nature anyway, so the pair moving from one adventure to the next, so the format of the story flowed naturally in the graphical format. My library had just the adaptation of The Colour of Magic, so for me, Rincewind's story ended here on a cliffhanger. But the graphic novel made me aware of the Discworld, and I then went on to hunt down some other books. Equal Rights, Mort, Going Postal, all great on their own. None of them quite hooked me and made me hunt down the rest of the series. But then many years later came the television adaptation starring David Jason and Sean Astin, which offers an entirely different take on these two characters, turning them into an elderly inoffensive bumbler and a keen but outwardly obnoxious American tourist. And during that version, I then returned to the source material, finding an abridged audiobook read by Sir Tony Robinson, who invests such wit and life into the characters, his voice feels like the definitive voice of the series. But when, some months later still, having gone through every single one of the Discworld franchise in the abridged form, I finally decided to go back and just check the original book. And I found that there was yet more to discover. As good as Tony Robinson's narration is, the source material is often heavily abridged. Each iteration of this story brought to it something the others didn't, but, well, I'd personally, because it's the last version I experienced, struggle to call the original book the definitive take, as despite containing the most material, it's also very clear from reading it just how far the author improved as a writer as he went on and developed the Discworld further. As I said, the story feels extremely episodic, but the flow between segments is almost non-existent. The opening portion of the book is told in flashback by Rincewind to two onlookers watching the city of Ankh-Morpork burn, whilst trying to fathom how it happened. This opening segment is perhaps the strongest part of the novel, as it has a natural flow from the arrival of Twoflower, the chaos his very presence brings, and the all-too-inevitable fallout that leads to him and Rincewind fleeing the city. Sadly, after they leave the city, the details become rather sketchy, their absence only half excused by Terry Pratchett's frequent rambling asides where he explores a magical or theoretical concept with wry humour. In fact, at one point, for no reason, the story just skips forward to show a bedraggled and haggard pair of adventurers arrive at the final destination complaining about the exciting/thrilling journey that the reader's been kept largely oblivious of. This is all a pastiche on a genre that has moved on significantly over the decades since Mr. Pratchett published the original book. The hard-worn stereotypes he riffed on here have been replaced, possibly several times over, by brand new stereotypes. That is not to say there isn't much to love in The Colour of Magic, but the book makes an impenetrable read. Each individual segment works on its own, but they all feel isolated. Aside from the presence of Rincewind and Twoflower, who moves through the story with the grace of a brick passing through a slab of butter, there is little through line. Characters appear and vanish with little consequence, most appearing well written, and with appealing characteristics that prevent them from being one-note bit parts, but few then have the space to actually leave a lasting impression. What does leave an impression is the world itself. The unending, overwhelming sense of chaos that permeates this book, it doesn't let up to the end. The concept is great, but the execution in The Colour of Magic itself, maybe less so. It's not badly written by any means, far from it, and it's largely comical, but the written text is perhaps the weakest format of the story, particularly as it's only half an adventure, ending in a particularly brutal cliffhanger and then a duff joke that will only get picked up on properly in the sequel book, The Light Fantastic. Perhaps this is why I was drawn into the graphic novel so deeply. Fragmented tales work in the comic format. It's how the medium is often designed to function. With each reimagining of The Colour of Magic, the content would be refined, the links that pull the story together tightened, and I am so glad that most of these reworkings occurred during the author's lifetime. But of course, none of that would have been possible without the solid original text to build it all from. But then, 3 years later, I jumped from 1983 to 1986, the second book of the Discord series would solve all of these problems. Make no mistake, whilst it's not as famous, The Light Fantastic is excellent justification. The Discord is a place that follows archetypal fantasy, but does so through the lens of cynicism and wit. Its scope comes through a little clearer in the second attempt than in the predecessor, The Colour of Magic. Rather than riffing on high fantasy books with warrior maidens, gambling gods and nameless horrors, it offers a cottage made of sweets, an aged Conan the Barbarian, and a political struggle within the halls of wizardry as the devilish Trimon plots his way to the top. The set pieces, because like its predecessor, the plot is little more than loose movement from one to the next, are much shorter and snappier, resulting in much better flow. Perhaps the most significant improvement in this book is that it has more than two real protagonists. Though Terry Pratchett has a great gift for imbibing a hook into every character he writes, pushing one quirk or humanising detail to give them life, most serve only to advance either the plot or a joke. In the first half of this tale, only a few characters beside Rincewind and Twoflower had the room for real depth, as they came and went so quickly, but The Light Fantastic shows the reward of sticking with a good character to let them develop. Trimon is an excellent villain, a man whose selfishness threatens to destroy the world, and by putting this academic superstar against the dropout Rincewind, we finally get some evolution in the main hero in return. Although he's fun at first, Rincewind is not an ideal protagonist. He's a reactive presence, somebody who responds in an interesting manner to any situation he finds himself in, but he does little to drive the story forwards. Pratchett was quoted as saying he created a character primarily to give him a vehicle to meet other, more interesting people, which he certainly manages. And whilst his character doesn't exactly develop here, it does go through some important experiences that mesh well with the theme of the book. And at the end, the underlying plot, that despite initial appearances does actually exist and was just biding its time, it hangs together on a few clever revelations that subtly reward the big questions posed from the first book without explicitly answering them. There are so many fantasy tropes and references stuffed into these books It feels as though Terry Pratchett was in a rush to get through them all and get them out of the way as quick as possible. The first characters you meet, even before Rincewind and Twoflower, are pastiches on Farfred and the Grey Mouser, progenitors of the sword and sorcery genre that date all the way back to the 1930s. The homage takes these fun but essentially very silly concepts and gives us two takes on the characters who are very down to earth and human. It then follows with a genre mashup of H.P. Lovecraft horror with Dungeons and Dragons roleplay, and then what seems to be a PG-13 take on Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders series. None of these would be as blatant or well considered though as the standout appearance of Cohan the Barbarian. Originating in pulp magazines, the original Conan the Barbarian, also from the 1930s, has starred in books, comics, television programs, movies, video games, and everything you can imagine. And in pretty much every one of these depictions, he's a strapping, chivalrous, muscle-bound young man with peak physical fitness. There are depictions of him aging, which typically involve him taking on a commanding presence, becoming a strong war leader, leading a charge of a cast of armies seeking political dominance. However, Pratchett's keen eye saw something in the character that would work even if you aged him up another half a century onwards after that. Youth and virility itself are not enough, and there are more interesting stories to be told about heroes who have lived on past the legend built up around them. Rincewind himself would go on to star in only a few more of the Discworld books, as Terry Pratchett found it difficult to centre a story about a character with no inner monologue. Twoflower would only be seen once or twice again, as he really was a joke which had worn itself out by the end of these two stories. However, the world, the city, the concept of Ankh-Morpork would endure, and concepts originated here would dominate the Discworld for years to come. The Patrician, the University, Death, the Great Turtle would set the scene of so many great adventures. However, some of the more fantastical elements would be quietly excised away. Pratchett seemed to realise that quality rather than quantity mattered when doing parody. Better to fully examine one great concept than carry out a rush safari, running through all of your great ideas, giving them each a moment to nod and wave before they're left in the dust. The series would refocus, re-engage and prosper for years to come, building a voracious audience desperate to consume over 80 million books that were translated into 37 separate languages. Future creations such as Granny Weatherax, Sam Vimes, Death, Moist von Lipwig, Tiffany Aching, whilst poor Rincewind would lie almost forgotten. A mascot the series seemed almost ashamed of. If we can draw any comfort from his mistreatment, it's that he probably enjoys it that way. If the Discworld had begun and ended with 2 books, it would have been an extremely diverting aside but little more. There are great ideas here, but until the second book, little patience to fashion them into a cohesive whole. It's deliberately written in an anarchic style, rebelling against the genre, taking pot shots at its source material, rather than focusing on its own ideas. And its own ideas are brilliant, but they only come through at the end, almost as a capstone of the journey. This is witty and often fun, but the balance is fundamentally flawed. However, the blueprints for something bigger are there, and I do recommend this, both as a historical record for anyone curious of how it all began, and anyone who just wants to know about the sex of the turtle.